and becomes conservative and inward looking, and therefore rules of caste, rules of gender had become solidified and rigid in a way that they never had been in the past. But nonetheless, there were practices that we would regard as iniquitous, and not really even in the ancient past either. I mean, I was in Kerala a few months ago, and I was reading there about how some of the temples there, not just the temples, but the roads to the temples had been barred to the lower classes. And this is talking about the 20s and the 30s. I think it was the Guruvayur temple was stormed by members of the lower castes in the 1930s who sought to gain access to them. That was barred. I can even recall a gentleman who used to come to one of our classes in London, quite an elderly gentleman. When we were talking about this, he said he could remember in his childhood in India growing up and seeing people standing outside the temple who were barred admission to the temple. So there were practices that we modern people, Hindu and non-Hindu alike, would regard today as wholly unacceptable. I think Gandhi in the 20s, when he was campaigning for the right of widows to remarry, he pointed out that there were, I think the figure was 330,000 widows in India under the age of 15, and that means girls, children really, who would never be allowed to remarry, but would have to eke out a miserable existence as widows. Clearly iniquitous practices, but these were seized upon by the British rulers to justify their presence, and by the missionaries in order to justify a demand for conversion to Christianity and escape from the iniquities of Hindu dharma. So the reformers are closely connected to the nationalist movement and the restoration of India's pride in its own culture. Let's just mention, time is limited, I want to mention particularly perhaps three individual figures and place them within that context, and try and demonstrate the way in which they sought to reform the Hindu tradition. Now, in his book which is about the history of Christianity, David Chidester, it's quite a thick tome on the world history of Christianity, when he writes about Christianity in India, he entitles his chapter Hindu Christians, and he talks about people like Vivekananda, Gandhi, Ram Mohan Roy as being Hindu Christians. His contention is that it was Christianity that was the driving impetus for people like Dayananda, Gandhi, Vivekananda. They were inspired by Christianity. Of course, they didn't convert to Christianity, but their inspiration towards reform of Hinduism came from Christian sources. Now, I would say Chidester is completely wrong there. He is wrong. I don't want to be too critical, but I don't think he really understands Hinduism, because the point I'm going to make is that all of these figures, with perhaps the possible exception of Ram Mohan Roy, were entirely Hindu, and the resources, the intellectual, spiritual, religious resources that they used in order to reform and transform the tradition in which they lived were entirely Hindu. And let's look at that with that idea in mind to demonstrate it was. I'm not saying there was no Western influence upon them, and maybe Western criticisms provided something of an impetus, but the way they reformed Hinduism was not by making reference to some outside source of authority or teaching. They looked within their own tradition and reformed by using resources from within their own tradition. Let's talk first of all about Dayananda Saraswati, and the details of his life we can pick up from other sources. Dayananda Saraswati is well known as the founder of the Arya Samaj. Interesting history. He lived an early life of a sannyasi, travelling all around India. He's famously born into a Shaivite family, but after staying awake all night at Shivaratri and seeing, I think, rodents, I'm not sure whether it was mice or rats. I prefer to think of mice. They're not quite as repulsive as rats. But anyway, he was watching the altar and he saw the offerings being eaten by rodents. He then came to the conclusion that the murti could not be a true manifestation of God. So he campaigned against what he saw as later additions to the pristine Hinduism. And he rejected caste, he rejected discrimination against women, and he also rejected Murti Puja, the worship of images in temple. And still to this day, the Arya Samaj ritual is based on the fire yajna, the Vedic ritual, and not the later ritual of Murti Puja. Now, the crux of Dayananda's argument here, and I am summarising, his argument is far more involved than that. The crux of his argument is not that we should stop doing these things because we should start listening to the Christians, just the opposite. He had no time for Christianity or Islam, and in fact his book Satyartha Prakash, in chapters I think 11 and 12, he has a systematic demolition. He's quite a, what would you say, a vituperative speaker, quite acerbic in his language, Dayananda, very critical. He equally dismisses Christianity and Islam as nonsensical, and indeed later Hinduism. But his point is, Hinduism should be the Hinduism of the Veda. He's not looking outside Hinduism, he's looking within Hinduism and saying, let's go back to our original, pure, perfect Vedic religion and get rid of all this other stuff. He calls it Puranic religion. So he rejects all notion, and Ram Mohan Roy earlier was similar in this respect, an admirer of the Upanishads, a rejecter of ritual and later notions. So he rejects even the notion of avatar, he rejects Murti Puja, he rejects caste, he rejects gender inequality on the basis that these features of contemporary Hinduism are not Vedic. And he's right in that sense. The Veda, the Upanishads, the Shruti does not refer to Murti Puja. There is one verse, I think, of one Vedic hymn, I might be wrong, there might be other references as well, which refers to the Varna system, which is the division of society into 4 social classes. No reference, though, to the caste system within the Veda. There's that one hymn, the Purusha Sukta, which refers in one verse to it. Elsewhere, through the vast corpus of Vedic literature, caste doesn't play a part. So Dayananda's point is, it's not Hinduism, it's a social system that has evolved in India for practical purposes, but Hindus don't have to practice that. It's not Hindu. So therefore the criticism of Hindu from outside is misplaced. Real Hinduism doesn't do this. Moreover, he points out that, and again he's right in this, he says that the Vedic injunction on performing of the Vedic ritual demand that a man and his wife, the Yajaman, the performer, not the priest but the sponsor of the yajna, who sits at the centre, must have his wife by his side. We may recall in the Ramayana at the end, after Ram has banished Sita and he wants to do I think an Ashwamedh yajna, he can't do it because he hasn't got a wife, and so they say to him, marry someone else. He won't, because he's still devoted to Sita. So they have, I think, a gold murti of Sita made to sit next to him. But the point that Dayananda would make was, in Vedic society, in the Vedic religion, there was no discrimination against women at all. Men and women performed the ritual as equal co-partners. Sahadharmini, it's mentioned in the Mahabharata as well. They're perfectly equal. And this discrimination against women, things like sati, the relegation of women to a position of constitutional inferiority that was the case in India, that is not Vedic. That is a later accretion, an addition, and that Hinduism should reform itself by going back to its original Vedic roots. So again, I'll go back to that point. It's not Hindu-Christian. It's a Hindu looking to his own ancient tradition in order to reform it and return it, as he saw it, to its original pristine condition. Now, one might be somewhat critical of the Arya Samaj and Dayananda, particularly over Murti Puja, and in fact Murti Puja is and remains a major facet of Hindu ritual. And in fact, my experience has been that the Arya Samaj position against Murti Puja has somewhat moderated. They don't do it. They still do the Vedic yajna,